Everyone to this webinar. We're excited to welcome the over 200 registrants to join us today for a conversation with PILPG's Circle of Former Ambassadors to the Human Rights Council. Today, we will be reflecting on 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the work of the Human Rights Council. My name is Paul Williams, and I am the co-founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group. I am honored today to be co-moderating this roundtable alongside the Circle of Former Ambassadors co-chair, Ambassador Joachim Rucker, the former ambassador of Germany to the United Nations in Geneva, and the former president of the United Nations Human Rights Council. I'm also delighted to be joined by our esteemed panelists from PILPG's Circle of Former Ambassadors, Ambassador Yvette Stevens, Ambassador Amanda Ellis, and Ambassador Jorge Lamonico. Please note that this roundtable will be 60 minutes long, and it will be recorded and posted on our website. We ask that you please submit any questions that you have in the Q&A, and our speakers will do their best to answer those questions throughout the course of the roundtable discussion. Now, before we move into our full introductions of our panelists and the rest of today's discussion, we are honored to be able to welcome Her Excellency Ambassador Yevgenia Filipenko, who is the permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations in Geneva. Ambassador Filipenko, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me today. It gives me a pleasure and privilege to participate in this roundtable discussion.
Now, Ambassador Filipenko, in light of the one-year anniversary of Russia's gross violation of human rights and its invasion of Ukraine, we would be grateful to hear your reflections on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and what are Ukraine's priorities for the Human Rights Council in 2023?
Thank you. Thank you again. I want to thank you, Paul Williams, co-founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group and the Circle of Distinguished Ambassadors, because there is no such thing as former ambassadors. As after the service, we all remain part of a global diplomatic circle dedicated to advancing the principles of diplomacy and multilateralism. Indeed, tomorrow will mark 1 year anniversary since the start of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine in grave breach of the principles of the UN Charter and international humanitarian and human rights law. A year that has passed has felt like an eternity for millions of Ukrainians, including myself. It has been a year of unspeakable suffering, which saw gross and systematic violations of human rights committed by Russia on Ukraine's territory. Russia's war of aggression has been a direct attack on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Vienna Declaration and Plan of Action, and other human rights legal instruments, the anniversary of which will be marked this year. By killing thousands of innocent civilians, forcing millions to flee homes, reducing entire cities to rubble, continuing deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure with missiles and drones, Russia has violated every provision of these landmark documents. The UN human rights mechanisms have extensively documented cases of torture, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, conflict-related sexual violence, concentration and filtration camps, forcible deportation. The International Commission of Inquiry set up by the UN Human Rights Council in March 2022 established that war crimes and violations of human rights and international law have been committed in Ukraine by Russia. So there must be no impunity for Russia's crime against Ukrainian people. At the current session of the Human Rights Council, the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry, which documents evidence of Russia's widespread and systematic violations of human rights, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, the mandate will be extended for 1 year. So we are preparing the draft resolution to be presented to the Human Rights Council to extend the mandate of this commission for another year. Another priorities of Ukraine at the upcoming Human Rights Council session would be 3 topics. The first one is disinformation. It was Ukraine initiative in the past few years to promote the issue and raise awareness of the issue of disinformation and its impact on human rights and responsibilities of states for spreading disinformation. So at this session, we will be organizing a side event devoted to this topic, following up to the resolution which was adopted by consensus last year, and the debates that were held in the margins of the Human Rights Council. So this at this session we will have a report on this issue, and we will organize a side event dedicated to the issue of disinformation. The second issue is accountability. Accountability is the core word for human rights prevention, for justice, and it's the core word for the whole system of human rights protection. So we will be organizing an event on accountability, and we will raise the issue, the initiative of Ukraine on the creation of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression committed by Russia since 2014. And the third topic is also of very much significance, is the deported children. This is one of the most deplorable crimes committed by Russia. You have seen the report by the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, which discovered a terrifying system of camps stretching from the Black Sea coast to Siberia, being used to deport at least 6,000 Ukrainian children and make Russians out of them through the so-called political re-education. Under the international law and under the Genocide Convention, 17th anniversary of which we will mark this year, forcible transfer of children of one group to another constitutes a genocide. So we will be raising this issue at the side event during the Human Rights Council. So to respond to these violations, we need to join forces, government, academia, ambassadors, experts, legal community, media, activists. We need to work together to bring Russia into account for their crimes.
Thank you, Ambassador Filipenko, for those rather chilling comments about the extent of Russia's disinformation, about the dire need for accountability, and what's happened to those 6,000 children who've been kidnapped as part of a program of genocide. Recently, the United States publicly declared that Russia is committing crimes against humanity in Ukraine and against the people of Ukraine. And that tracks exactly with your 3 priorities. What do you make of America's declaration? Will this add substantial impetus for a special tribunal for aggression? And how can we, your friends, help to build upon the momentum that is hopefully being created by America's declaration of this violation of crimes against humanity?
The evidences of gross and systematic violations of human rights, war crimes, and crimes against humanity have been extensively documented by all human rights monitoring mechanisms. I mentioned the Commission of Inquiry. We have the Human Rights Monitoring Mission, human rights, non-governmental organizations. They all provide the international community with the facts, with the truth, with the facts of all kinds of crimes being committed by Russia against Ukraine. And of course, we are building the coalition with the United States, and others in the leading role of that coalition to bring Russia and its political and military leadership into account. We strongly support investigation by the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC. Our parliament has adopted several laws to strengthen cooperation with the ICC. So we're fully committed to continue working together with the ICC in the fight against impunity, and look forward to the investigations by the ICC, in particular indictments and arrest warrants to Russian nationals for committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in Ukraine. As I mentioned, we also must work together with the United States and other partners to ensure accountability for the crime of aggression. Since currently there is no international court or tribunal which can exercise jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, we believe it is imperative to close this accountability gap and establish a special tribunal which would be able to do that. We will spare no effort to prosecute Russia political and military leadership and its allies for the crime of aggression through the creation of this special tribunal. We must also make Russia pay reparation for the damage and injury caused by its criminal actions in violation of international law. So to conclude, I would like to say that we must bring justice for millions of Ukrainians whose lives have been changed forever due to Russia's war. And we really hope that this year, commemorating important anniversaries, will be the year of triumph of international law, the year of justice, and the year of Ukraine's victory.
Right. Thank you, Ambassador Filipenko. Those are very moving remarks in terms of the need for accountability, the need to stop these crimes against humanity, this genocide, and the need to create a mechanism for reparations for the harm that's being done to the people of Ukraine. We're very grateful that you've been able to take the time to join us today on this roundtable. I know you were previously scheduled to be just about now being introduced at another event, but you made some space to come and join our roundtable. So we will bid farewell so that you can head off to your keynote presentation. But again, thank you very much. We're honored and privileged that you were able to spend some time with us today on this roundtable.
Thank you very much, and I wish you fruitful discussions today. I know that we can count on you as much as you can count on us.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Let's turn now to a discussion that continues within the context of Ambassador Filipenko's remarks about the need for full and dynamic implementation of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. As we mentioned in the introduction, and as Ambassador Filipenko noted, this is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration. And the Human Rights Council, which begins its first session of the year on Monday, the 27th, will be thinking about how best to implement the provisions of the Universal Declaration that may not have been fully achieved in these last 75 years. Over the course of the remaining 45 minutes, the circle of former ambassadors, or as Ambassador Filipenko said, continuing in perpetuity ambassadors when it comes to human rights. Let's have Joachim take a moment and introduce our panelists, and then I'll kick it off with the first question.
Right. Thank you very much, Paul. And it's really an honor to be in this circle today. And I would like to introduce the other participants. We're honored to welcome Ambassador Yvette Stevens, former ambassador and permanent representative to the UN and former chair and rapporteur spearheading the Human Rights Council's intersessional seminars with states and other relevant stakeholders on the contribution of the Human Rights Council to the prevention of human rights. It's great to have you, Yvette. We're also excited to welcome Ambassador Amanda Ellis, New Zealand's former head of mission, permanent representative and ambassador to the UN in Geneva. Ambassador Ellis is currently Senior Director for the Arizona State University Julie Ann Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, a professor of practice at Thunderbird Global School of Management, and co-chair of the UN We Empower Sustainable Development Goals Challenge. It's great to have you, Amanda, and to see you again. We are also delighted to have Ambassador Jorge Lomanaco, former ambassador of Mexico to the United Nations in Geneva and member of the Human Rights Council. Ambassador Lomanaco has recently held the position of ambassador and permanent observer of Mexico to the Council of Europe. For full speakers' biographies, please visit the PILPG website. Welcome everyone, and thank you for agreeing to participate in today's important panel.
Well, you're welcome. Let's kick off the first question with you. During this year of the Human Rights Council, there's an initiative on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Could you share with us a little bit about the purpose of this initiative for the Universal Declaration? I understand there's three main priorities of this initiative. If you could review those and let us know what you anticipate the Human Rights Council will be attempting to do in order to promote the implementation or the further implementation of the Universal Declaration.
Well, the Human Rights Council has contributed and will continue to raise awareness of the links between the human rights and climate change these days. And going back to the beginnings, 75 years, it has played an important role since its inception in 2006. And before, I think we had various mechanisms, including the Human Rights Commission with a sort of a, well, interesting ending at the beginning of the millennium. But the main purpose was and has been to protect human rights and further the human rights cause in the UN system and globally.
Thank you, Joachim. Let's turn to Yvette now. From 2018 to 2020, you were the chair and the rapporteur of the series of seminars relating to the contribution of the Human Rights Council for the prevention of human rights violations. And oftentimes the Human Rights Council is seen as a reactionary mechanism, but as you noted in your work with those seminars, it has an equally valid mission of preventing human rights violations. Can you talk to us a little bit about that mandate and some of the outstanding issues?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for including me and the important question of prevention in a roundtable of this type, where we are looking back at the work at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I would start by referring to Resolution 6251 of the setting up of the Human Rights Council, and there was a particular paragraph which I'd read out. It's that the Council could contribute through dialogue and cooperation towards the prevention of human rights violations and respond promptly to human rights emergencies. Whilst I was still a member and whilst I was an ambassador, we had a group of countries had stressed the need for the Human Rights Council itself to be more engaged in preventing human rights violations. I mean, that is to say that usually the Council reacts when something has gone wrong. I always say when the genie is out of the bottle and trying to put it back, and that is always very difficult. whereas this resolution gave the council the mandate to do more on prevention. So this was the background towards the resolution and the setting up of this group, 3 of us, to look into how the Human Rights Council itself could enhance its role in prevention. Now, it was very, I mean, we had a lot of cooperation in terms of looking at it, but then we took a close look at what the council has and it could be better use of in terms of preventing. And one is the Universal Periodic Review. Every single country, all 192 member states of the UN are submitted to the Universal Periodic Review. And the recommendations that come out are given by every other state present a clear picture, if you look at them carefully, of the human rights situation in a given country. And you would find that these recommendations the countries take back, they accept some they said we are considering. But what is important is that the Human Rights Council itself does not pay great attention to the implementation of these recommendations. And if the recommendations are not implemented, it means that the issues that these recommendations address are not being taken into account. So one of the things that we stress in our report to the Human Rights Council is that the Human Rights Council should not be content in just having the Universal Periodic Review. Countries take home the recommendations and come back 3 or 4 years later, and everybody say, why didn't you implement this? Why didn't you implement that? And the recommendations are repeated. So the major thing is that we found that for some countries, and I have the experience myself, for some countries that really want to implement the recommendations, do not have the know-how or the means to do it, there's no way where they could turn to for such help. And so one of the recommendations which we made was that there should be some facility where countries that want, at the request of countries, could be given what assistance they require to implement the recommendations they have accepted. The reason being is that if these recommendations are implemented, it will be what we call the primary prevention. It will prevent these human rights violations taking place in the first place. And this is why, you know, these violations are the first signs that lead to conflict after a time. So if these recommendations are indeed implemented, it will go a long way in preventing, in the area of prevention of human rights violations. Now, of course, for prevention, if you have prevented something, it didn't happen. So it's very difficult to go back and say we prevented it because it didn't happen. But anyway, the other thing that we pointed out to is that the Human Rights Council should be more proactive in addressing early warning signals. What happens now is that all the early warnings come from all over, you know, the Amnesty International, the NGOs, local people are talking, but the Human Rights Council itself doesn't help, doesn't act until conflict starts, and then there's a special session to address this. And what we saw in this is that the council itself could do much more. And we recommended that the OHCHR is equipped with the capacity for sustained monitoring of all the signals that come up. And when the analysis show points to some impending crisis, that the High Commissioner would inform the Human Rights Council, the President, and then there could be various course of action. There could be having goodwill missions. They could be engaging the countries concerned at the stage before this conflict actually emerges. And we believe that the Human Rights Council could do much more in this regard. And only when all fails, because we are not saying that if this is done, there's not going to be conflict. But when it all fails, then we can go to the next stage, which is the special session. But we should do a lot more before that. Other recommendations which we made was that the link between the different pillars of the UN, because we always say human rights, people say human rights is the third pillar. I always insist that human rights is one of the 3 pillars, because if you make it third, you are already giving it least significance. And with the Human Rights Council does everything it can do, but it lacks that crucial link with the Security Council. If you're really talking about prevention, the Human Rights Council, and really the Human Rights Council works very hard, but then, you know, they do not have the direct link. They cannot even speak. When we're doing this, some of the members of the Security Council would not even discuss with us coming from the Human Rights Council. So this is how bad it is. I don't know how that could be avoided, but this is crucial. If we're really talking about preventing conflicts, there has to be a formal link between the Human Rights Council and the Security Council. And of course, I mean, linking the human rights to development is easier because that is already now being done with the new resident coordinator system, which is in place, which helps within the country to collect warning signals that if the analysis of OHCHR is up to date, would put it all together to determine what to do before situations lead to conflict. So basically, this is what we have come up with, and I must say that the last president of the Human Rights Council did try to do this, trying and mediation and talking in private, because we also noted that usually it works best when it's confidential at that initial stage. Then countries do not feel that they're being named and shamed, and if that serves a purpose, then why not use it? So at that point, this is the general thrust of the report which we presented to the Human Rights Council. We still are, I must say this before I go, I mean, a lot of it is not implemented because of resources. Because even the early warning capacity within OHCHR was only provided for something like 6 months because there was no budget. But what I would like to say is that we have to stress that if you think prevention is expensive, then imagine what it is when it is not prevented. We all see when these conflicts emerge, we hear billions, but then we won't spend a couple of millions in preventing human rights violations.
No, Ambassador, it reminds me that the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and it seems that your very cogent recommendations are cost-effective and hopefully mechanisms that the Human Rights Council will pick up this year and act upon. It would be nice reactivated focus on prevention as we move forward into the 75th year. Let me now turn it to my co-chair, Joachim, to pivot into some questions on climate change.
Right, thank you very much. I mean, I want to mention on one thing that Yvette so forcefully stressed, which is the underfunding of the human rights pillar in the UN system. I think the current UN budget only foresees something like 3% for human rights work. So if you compare it to development cooperation, if you compare it to security, it's totally underfunded, and that must be cured, and that ties right into more prevention work. With regard to what you mentioned, Paul, the climate change and human rights, I think that the HRC has contributed to raising awareness of the links between human rights and climate change through targeted clarifications of the ways climate change affects human rights, and has adopted quite a series of resolutions that relate to climate change and human rights. Key principles of international and environmental law apply to climate action in the context of human rights, including but not limited to the principles of equality and non-discrimination, transparency and inclusiveness, and precautionary principle. I would like to turn to Ambassador Ellis. Amanda, with this in mind, what is a human rights-based approach to climate change, and what is the role of the UN Human Rights Council in addressing climate change? How can the UN Human Rights Council respond to climate change in a participatory and empowering way? I think that's custom-made for you, Amanda.
Well, 3 very important questions. Thank you so much, Joachim, and such an honor to be here with former colleagues. I would like to begin with a formal greeting in Māori, which is the Indigenous language of my homeland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā rangatiratanga, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. This very important greeting reminds us too of the importance of not only leadership, but wisdom, and particularly Indigenous wisdoms in addressing these issues. And climate is top of mind for me at the moment. New Zealand declared only its first ever state of emergency, national emergency, due to cyclone and floods recently. And living here in Hawaii, which as an island state is on the front lines of climate change, we're really seeing the impacts of sea level rise right before our eyes. So these three questions are very important ones for me. And the Human Rights Council has played a very important role through these 12 different resolutions that you alluded to. Climate change impacts the rights to life, to health, food, security, water and sanitation, self-determination of Indigenous peoples, cultural rights, and of course, the important overlay of differentiation by gender, socioeconomic factors that can create disproportionate vulnerabilities, things like land tenure, for example, which women are often prevented from having. And we're seeing too the considerable increase in migration, both with internal displacement and internationally. So all of those are very important issues for us to be thinking about. And I was very pleased to see the UN Secretary General's report that was commissioned by the Council, which is on the impacts of climate change on the human rights of people in vulnerable situations. And some of those recommendations are particularly pertinent. The importance of addressing the root causes. Those most responsible must lead climate action, and it is to be reminded that the G20 is responsible for 80% of global greenhouse gases, while those on the front lines, small islands and the least developed states are responsible for around 3% of emissions, and yet are the ones who suffer the most. Including people in vulnerable situations in climate action and ensuring that they are seen as agents of change. And that relates to early warning systems, which are still not universal, the importance of access to justice, protecting environmental human rights defenders, and the importance of involving all people in decision-making and planning, right down to the community level. And we have a very interesting example just at ASU, where we have a global youth mappers program to help ensure that youth are involved in helping to map critical infrastructure. So a direct response to this recommendation. And of course, then increasing levels of climate action and climate finance. The preamble to the Paris Agreement also references human rights. So we do see an integrated approach, which is good, across the World Bank system, and the importance of member states actually acting on their Paris Agreement commitments. Now, interestingly, in relation to this, some of you will have heard Mia Motley in the Bridgetown Initiative, the importance of engaging our multilateral institutions also in support of a human rights-based approach to climate change. And the World Bank has just come out with its first climate change and development reports. So interestingly, they do go beyond the recommendations of the Paris Agreement in terms of really looking with a clear eye at what needs to happen and ensuring that those issues like poverty alleviation, which has a clear correlation to the human rights aspect, are looked at. And just finally, prevention. Climate change is an issue where there has already been much damage done, but we know that the precautionary principle and the great work that Ambassador Stevens is leading is absolutely critical, because we look at mitigation, we look at adaptation, and now most recently out of COP27, we have a first agreement to come up with a loss and damages fund, which is being talked about as a mosaic of solutions. So I could go on forever on this topic. So I will pause there and look forward to future questions.
Thank you, Amanda. Let's now pivot to a country-specific question and turn the microphone over to Ambassador Lamonaco. Recently, or actually a year ago, in March of 2022, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution that established a group of experts on human rights with a mandate to investigate and seek accountability for serious human rights violations in Nicaragua. Ambassador Lamonaco, can you share with us your assessment of the situation in Nicaragua, your evaluation of the effectiveness of this mechanism over the past year, and what should the Human Rights Council be doing now, moving forward with respect to the crisis in Nicaragua?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for placing attention in Latin America. Because Latin America is facing many challenges in human rights, and they are twofold. On the one hand, diminished appetite to protect human rights around the world, and a deterioration of the human rights situation in several countries. Let me briefly mention other countries other than Nicaragua. Countries like El Salvador and Mexico, my own country, are showing less and less commitment to protecting human rights, while their respective governments keep undermining the fragile democratic institutions in place. My own country, for example, has become the most dangerous for journalists and has accumulated over 100,000 disappear and more than 150,000 violent deaths in just 4 years. Just recently, Peruvian authorities successfully resisted a self-coup attempt. However, the new government has been unable or maybe unwilling to call for early elections, which in my view are essential for stability, and is responsible for a violent crackdown against protesters. But of course, the real bad apples in the region are the three dictatorships: Cuba, Venezuela, and of course, Nicaragua. Since the Circle issued its last statement on Nicaragua, 94 additional Nicaraguans have been expelled, stripped of their nationality and political rights, but also seen their properties confiscated. Among these new victims, on top of the 222, none of which were detained or subject to legal process, are former high-ranking government officials that serve along Ortega, and some of the most respected Nicaraguans, intellectuals, writers, academics. On top of that, as we know, Monsignor Rolando José Álvarez, one of the 202 political prisoners that were freed, he refused to leave Nicaragua. In retaliation, he was rearrested and condemned without trial for 26 years in prison. The response in Latin America was silence, followed by a few isolated, timid reactions, except for President Boric of Chile. Although some Latin American countries have finally offered asylum and some sort of path to nationality to the victims, it was Spain, not any other Latin American country, not even the US, who set the example for addressing their statelessness, the victims' statelessness, forcefully and immediately. So much for Latin American solidarity. As the Circle urged in an earlier statement, you might remember, the Human Rights Council, in my view, should incorporate the situation of Nicaragua as a permanent agenda item and consider the possibility of calling for a special session dedicated to Nicaragua. Also, we should keep encouraging all victims of human rights violations in Nicaragua to submit as soon as possible their claims to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, or when appropriate, go directly to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Ambassador. Over to you, Joachim.
Right. We want to cover other subjects as well. And what comes to mind is, of course, gender issues. Gender equality is one of the key values of the UNHRC. Equality and non-discrimination are fundamental principles of the UN Charter, adopted by world leaders in 1945, yet global gender equality remains far off, and indeed only 12 countries presently legislate full gender equality. Ambassador Ellis, how can the existing international architecture best support the Human Rights Council in addressing gender issues, particularly considering the backsliding of gender equality that was seen across the world last year? And where are possibly areas of opportunity?
Thank you, Joachim. And it's important to remember that not a single country has yet achieved full gender equality. And you referenced the 12 that legislate for it. I think one of the interesting things is that the Women, Business and the Law Project at the World Bank, which documents this information and now has 190 of the 193 UN member states. One of the things that I think is so important is to make this information widely available. And I'm thrilled that this project, which I started back in 2007 as an economist at the World Bank, has now partnered with us to come out with an annual set of summaries. And there is a map which you can click on and get the latest summary through an AI mechanism, which ingests this latest data as lawyers in each of the countries updates it, so that this really empowers people to be able to see what is the situation in your country, where have there been recent reforms on gender equality, where has there been backsliding, as we have so unfortunately seen in Afghanistan and in Iran in recent times, and how is it that you can influence a mechanism for change. And I have to say that until I came to the UN Human Rights Council as ambassador, the full weight of the Universal Periodic Review mechanism had not been obvious to me. Having started this project at the bank to really shine a spotlight on gender equality and human rights, it wasn't until I was part of the group of ambassadors at the UN in Geneva that I recognized how critical it was for civil society to be able to have a voice and to have access to this knowledge so that member states could raise with others what they were doing to ensure this mechanism was being upheld. So the map that I referred to, and I'll drop a link in the chat, enables you to sign up so that you can have a notification a year out from your country coming up for review at the Human Rights Council with the Universal Periodic Review mechanism, and then 6 months out. So it enables full participatory approach. And I'm pleased to say that since the Women, Business and the Law Project began, there have been some 400 plus reforms. And watch out on International Women's Day this year. There are going to be some more positive announcements. Now, you mentioned backsliding, and when we look at the tragedy in Afghanistan with girls being prevented from going to school, women being prevented from attending university, this, of course, these are basic rights which are enshrined in the Universal Declaration. So the Human Rights Council must continue to call this out. And in Iran, for example, we saw something very unprecedented just recently. The first time that a civil society group called for the removal of a country from the UN Commission on the Status of Women successfully. So the Vital Voices Global Partnership reached out to current and former women heads of state through the Council of Women World Leaders. And I was very proud that our former Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who at the time was a sitting Prime Minister, was the only sitting head of state to sign that call, which was ultimately successful. So I think we're also seeing the empowerment of groups upholding human rights to work together with member states to draw attention to these egregious areas of backsliding and to create outcomes. So finally, where do I see ongoing opportunities? I'm privileged to be the co-author of the Gender Equality and Governance Index, and this provides a very clear and easy update of where countries have signed on to CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, where they are properly implementing and where the optional protocol has been signed or not, to again enable a full participatory approach to upholding gender equality in the context of human rights. I would like to finish. I'm sorry, I'm taking so much time. This is a subject very dear to my heart, and especially having been New Zealand's inaugural ambassador for women and girls. But I did want to just finish by saying I was thrilled to see that the Human Rights Council in July 2018 linked gender and climate. And we know from research that women are approximately 80% of victims, along with children, of climate change. So the Council's Resolution 38.4 in July 2018 recognized the integration of a gender-responsive approach into climate policies would increase the effectiveness of both mitigation and adaptation. And I think so important to understand what a threat multiplier climate change is to human rights, but also to finish on a positive note. Despite gender discrimination, women can be solutionaries, and that is really the thrust behind the We Empower UN SDG Challenge, which Antonio Guterres and then President of the World Bank, Jim Kim, launched at UNGA in 2018. And we're seeing so many wonderful examples, despite gender discrimination and despite the disproportionate impact of climate change on women, innovative solutions that women are coming up with around the world. And I will again put a link into the chat on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And over to you, Paul.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to turn the microphone to Yvette in 1 second, and then after that to Jorge. So Yvette, in the course of the last 50 minutes, there's been discussion of investigative mechanisms for Afghanistan, Ukraine, Nicaragua. I'm going to ask Jorge in a second about one for Venezuela. There's also the situation with Iran. What has been your experience with these investigative mechanisms in terms of prevention or, bringing attention to crises and situations? And what do you recommend for the Human Rights Council in 2023 to do with respect to investigative mechanisms? I think you're still on mute.
Yeah. Yes, the investigative are essential part of prevention, in fact, because I think that there should be no impunity on human rights atrocities, and unless those who are guilty of that are held accountable, then these violations, these atrocities will continue. So I think it's extremely important that the investigative mechanisms put on record the human rights atrocities, the human rights, the break within a particular country while it is happening, so that afterwards, when the traditional justice system kicks in, those who are responsible would have to account for their actions. There should be no impunity. So I think the investigative mechanisms I see as an essential part of prevention.
Thank you, Yvette. And now turning to back to another country-specific conversation. Jorge, let's talk about Venezuela. The Human Rights Commissioner is going to be making an oral update in March with respect to the situation there. What do you anticipate the Human Rights Council could be doing in 2023 with respect to the situation in Venezuela?
Thank you, Paul. To understand what's going on in Venezuela, we need to look at the change in the Latin American landscape in the Human Rights Council in the last 7 to 8 years, since our time, essentially. Those days, you remember, Latin America was perceived as the region that could tip the balance of the Human Rights Council on many issues. Countries like Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Chile would often sponsor or vote in favor of important resolutions, making often the difference in tight votings. But that began to change as new governments with different values came into power. The emergence of the so-called pink tide, which is what is called a growing number of self-identified left-wing governments in the region, has been characterized as the turning point for this unfortunate, in my view, trend in Latin America. But I would argue that the commitment to human rights, or democracy, for that matter, has nothing to do with left or right. The case of Boric Chile and his government's commitment to the best causes is a good example. In Latin America, it has more to do this deterioration, this lack of commitment. It has to do with the rise of populist, illiberal governments run by strong men, not yet women, but essentially men, both from the right and the left, with an anti-Western, anti-American, anti-establishment, globally phobic vein, nostalgic of the Cold War, in some cases, the Soviet Union and the Cuban Revolution. Playing in this camp, you find Mexico or Argentina, arguably, according to them, on the left, as much as El Salvador, Bolsonaro's Brazil, or even Trump on the right. The so-called neutrality on the invasion of Ukraine and the silence on Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua can be partly explained by these traits. Now, human rights and democracy have been in really bad shape in Venezuela for years now. Since breaking its constitutional order, some people argue in 2015, some other would say 2017, complaints on serious human rights violations by the Maduro regime skyrocket. As you mentioned, the High Commissioner will give an oral update report on the international fact-finding mission, and I think is likely to include his recent visit to the country. A visit to a country like Venezuela is always a tricky, double-edged sword affair. On the one hand, we all strive for dialogue and cooperation. That's what we look for. This is the basis of the work of the Human Rights Council. But on the other hand, concessions are expected for any visit to be welcomed by an authoritarian regime under scrutiny, such as, I don't know, stage inspections, prevent visits to certain prisons, avoiding meetings with opponents and human rights defenders, maybe trying to influence the report of the visit. The former High Commissioner, in my view, was played by China. We can only hope that this time is different, and then a path for restoring democracy and the respect for human rights in Venezuela can be put together, including free and fair elections under international scrutiny. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Jorge. That was a very sobering assessment of the challenges facing the Human Rights Council and the global community vis-a-vis Venezuela. We have just a few minutes left. I want to turn to Amanda and have her address the question of what is happening in Syria with humanitarian assistance and it being essentially blocked for the areas held by the opposition in Syria by both the Syrians and by Russia. So in this hour, we're coming full circle back in a different country, but back to the mischievous and undermining behavior of Russia. So Amanda, if you would share with us some of your thoughts on what the Human Rights Council could be doing to address these situations where countries and their allies limit humanitarian assistance to their own people.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to refer to a very good piece which was recently published in Foreign Policy by Annie Sparrow and Hazem Rahami, which really addresses this question. It's titled, "Don't Rely on Assad to Get Aid to Syria's Earthquake Victims." And this is really dear to my heart, having served as co-chair on the Security Council for Humanitarian Access into Syria during New Zealand's tenure. And it's really so difficult when there is a very narrow interpretation taken of the right to access. And manipulation of access has really been a defining feature of the long-running Syrian conflict. When you look at the response in Turkey compared to rebel-held northwest Syria with the recent tragic earthquake, it's very obvious. And I, as an individual, would like to suggest that the very hyper-conservative UN legal approach, which requires the consent of the recipient country or UN Security Council approval, needs to change. It really needs to change. And we need to be thinking about this concept of human security and the importance of the rights of the people on the ground. So I could go on at great length, but I know we're nearing the end of our time, but so critical to really think about human security and right to access.
Amanda, my first job out of law school was working at the State Department legal office. And I think I said the exact same thing you said about the hyper-conservative interpretation of our friends up in the UN. This was in the context of the Yugoslavia conflict and dissolution and what could be done. And it was always the lawyers who said no. So as a law professor now at American University, I try to train the young lawyers to learn how to say yes to their clients sometimes.
Excellent to hear.
Well, thank you to our over 2,000 registrants for this webinar, for joining us today, and thank you to the circle of ambassadors for your very insightful and very thoughtful comments, sharing your experience, your wisdom, your thoughts, your ideas with those that are trying to get their head around how to make a difference in the world through the protection of human rights and through the further implementation of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So thank you for participating, Roundtable ambassadors, and thank you, the audience, for joining us today. And have a great early weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.